My name's Bob Morrison, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here with you today. When I grow up, I want to have Dave Wish's hairline. So, now before we get started into the presentation, I do have to correct one thing that Dave commented about. You see, I'm really not an accomplished musician. I'm a drummer. Yeah, it's true. Drummers are not musicians. They aren't. And we have it actually, it's in code that, and the definitive definition for drummers and musicians came from the 1932 Army Band Manual that said that the Army Band would be made up of 32 musicians and 3 drummers. So that's how I know to make that distinction. Now, most of my speeches tend to either be about data regarding arts education and access to arts education, or about advocacy, trying to overwhelm you with data and facts and figures about the importance of what you do and the impact that it has on children every day. I'm not going to talk about that today. The thrust of my presentation isn't really about either. I want to place the importance of what you're doing, what you're here to talk about, in the historical context through the particular lens that I view things through. My lens as an advocate, a warrior, an observer, a cajoler, a philanthropist, someone who's restored music programs, battling for music and arts education in our schools, working with everyone from parents and principals all the way up to the President of the United States. I have a particular point of view and frame of reference on this that I want to share with you to help you be empowered as you go back to your communities, not only as music educators, but as you work to be pioneers in this modern band movement. And the metaphor for my remarks really did not become clear to me until about 3 weeks ago. You see, at that time, I was in Washington, D.C., as part of a group that went to the nation's capital to advocate on behalf of music and arts education. I went on behalf of the National Association of Music Merchants. They brought in about 70 leaders and advocates from across the country, including this guy over here. That's Bernie Williams, right? So former Yankees there. We had Chris Martin, we had CEOs, we had teachers, we had James Brown's daughter was there advocating with us on behalf of music and arts education. And it's always exciting to go down there because I've done this work many times before. You see, this is not my first rodeo in Washington. I've actually been involved in Washington, D.C. for nearly 30 years. As a matter of fact, in 1994, this is a photograph from the release of the National Standards for Arts Education with Mike Green of the Recording Academy, Dick Riley, our Secretary of Education, John Mallman, president of MENC, some fat bald guy, and Larry Lincoln, the president of NAMM. So we were gathered that morning for the release of the national standards, celebrating the fact that the arts had now been made a core subject in our public schools. When I was there just last month, I was able to recreate a little bit of that photo. Mike Blakesley from NAFME, formerly MENC, Secretary Riley, Joe Lamond, who's now the president of NAMM, and again, some fat bald guy. So this has not been my first rodeo when I went to Washington. On our first evening together, though, we got to hear from a gentleman by the name of Congressman John Lewis. And Congressman John Lewis is famous for his role in the civil rights movement. And he regaled us with stories from his youth in Troy, Alabama. He spoke about raising chickens, about segregation, his call to the civil rights movement. He spoke about Selma and Dr. King, of the violence in the South and the historic moment on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when Dr. King said, "I have a dream." And then he stood before us in that room and he said, "Without music, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings." Now, the importance of those words they registered, but they really didn't register with me at that point in time. It would take some time for it to register, and by Wednesday we had spent the day lobbying in Washington, D.C., and in the evening I was all excited and my brain was just all frenzied with everything that's going on. And I say this to you today while right now, this very instant, the U.S. Senate is debating the reauthorization to the the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and changes to that act to make music explicitly a core subject. As we speak, that's what's going on. So it was an invigorating week when I was there, and I couldn't sleep at all. And so I just kept waking up in the middle of the night, and it's 3 a.m., it's 4 a.m., it's 5:30, and finally I say, enough. I got to get up, I got to get dressed, I got to get out of here, I got to walk around, because my brain just wouldn't let me sleep. So we were only a few blocks from the National Mall, and I decided that I would put on my gym shorts instead of going to the treadmill in the hotel, which is usually what I would do. I would take a walk along the National Mall. And hopefully that would clear my brain out. But I'd been to the National Mall dozens of times before, but something was different on this day. At 5:30 in the morning, I walked onto the National Mall, and I didn't hear anything. No people, no children, no kids, no cars, no taxis, no nothing. It's like I had this great national landmark all to myself, so I could go for a walk and clear my head. So I started to do that, and I started to walk from the base of the Capitol between the buildings of the National Gallery of Art, both wings of the National Gallery of Art, and also, to my left, the National Air and Space Museum, the places that house memories about our innovation and creativity and imagination that we as a nation possess. I continued to move down the hall past the National Museum for the American Indian, housing a lot of their great cultural artifacts and their artwork and celebrating their music. I continued on as I walked by the Hirshhorn Museum. There, all of the contemporary artwork talk about innovation and imagination. The Hirshhorn is just filled with it. As I continued along, I went by the National Museum of Natural History, where a lot of our great natural resources are housed and celebrated. I continued on by the American History Museum. And in the American History Museum, one of our great icons, the Star-Spangled Banner. The flag that flew over Fort McHenry that on that morning let us know that our nation, our very young nation, survived a pivotal moment that could have turned out significantly differently. And the inspiration, obviously, for our Star-Spangled Banner. What was interesting as I continued on, as I passed the Museum of American History, I came across this new thing that's being built just to the south of the White House. It's the National Museum of African-American History and Culture. And in that building, different things are going to be there. Some things like the Chuck Berry's car, Leadbelly's lyrics, Miles Davis's horn, a museum celebrating the great musical and cultural traditions of our African-American community. And as I continued to walk, this theme of music and arts and the history of our nation really started to gel in my brain. They started to come together and form an idea. As I walked by the Washington Monument, I thought of the man, George Washington, one of our founding fathers, and his role in the American Revolution. And I thought of fifes and drums that called the army to battle. But I also thought of Washington playing his flute in duets with his granddaughter. I looked to my left and I saw the Jefferson Memorial and thought about Thomas Jefferson, his role in writing our Declaration of Independence. He himself a violinist who celebrated the arts and all that they meant to us as a culture. I turned back to my right and I saw the White House. And it made me think about the first person that took up residence in that building, or the first president to take up residence in the White House was John Quincy Adams. And John Adams said, He said that if I must study politics and war, that my sons may have liberty to study painting and poetry, mathematics and philosophy, that my sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, tapestry, and porcelain. That's John Adams. And then it led me to think about my own experiences at the White House, where I executive produced a broadcast called The Concert of the Century to celebrate music education at that time in 1999, the fall of 1999, with President Clinton. And as we were going to break, we were not live at the time, he takes to the stage and he goes, "I don't think I would have been president if it weren't for my school music program." No more powerful words about the importance of what we do have ever been spoken. My problem was he said it to a room with 500 people under a tent and not live on national TV. So I had to go running up to him to the side and go, Mr. President, that was really great. When the cameras come back on, can you say it again?" And he did. And those words are now immortalized for everyone to use as they walk forward. So I continue my journey on. And I come to the World War II Memorial and think about all the things that went on at that period of time, and thought about Pearl Harbor, and walked by the arch paying tribute to the battle in the Pacific. And then I heard the voice of Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill, who was talking with his army treasurer, the treasurer was saying, "We need to cut out some of our arts and music so we can fund the war." And Winston Churchill said, "Are you kidding? What are we fighting for?" Right? I kept going by the Korean War Memorial and the Vietnam War Memorial. And indeed, what were we fighting for? As I continued on along the mall, I looked out down toward the Lincoln Memorial. As I continued toward the Lincoln Memorial, I began to climb the steps. In that memorial, I got to take a look at Lincoln to see what was happening. I turned to my left and looked at the Gettysburg Address, the poetry that was on the wall. I then walked out between those columns with him, and I thought about the empty vista that I was looking across at the Capitol. And I stood in the place where Martin Luther King stood some 50 years ago. I stood in the place where his noble lieutenant, John Lewis, stood, where the leaders of the civil rights movement stood, and I felt a shiver. Because then, finally, the scramble in my mind began to make sense. Remember, John Lewis had stood before us after reminiscing about his time in the civil rights movement, and he said that without music, the civil rights movement would have been like a bird without wings. What this walk along the National Mall revealed to me on that morning was this important fact. Our collective national, state, and local efforts on behalf of music and arts for everyone are connected in real and meaningful ways to the through lines of our great natural history. We are just one small part of a larger continuum of fulfilling the desires and dreams of both our founding fathers and our world leaders of our recent past that traverses our history for centuries and with a centrality to our humanity that I had not understood until that moment. All of us gathered here today are just the keepers of that flame. We are the ones that have the temporary responsibility of carrying forward that work and ensuring that we do our best to provide, in the vision of our founding fathers, the opportunity for our students to study music and poetry and porcelain. That is our right. That is our obligation. And it's our job to make sure that we take this obligation seriously with the work that we do every day. Now, the reason why I shared this with you is to provide a larger context to the context that I'm about to share, which is the historical context of what you do. So we're going to take a walk through history very quickly, and it starts with this. The first time music started to be looked at as a subject area was actually in 1717. It is our first singing school was created in Boston, Massachusetts. Why was it created? We needed better church singers. That's why they did it. We needed better church singers. So that's how the program was started. Popular music at the time was our church music. So that's how they started it. That was in an out-of-school context. In 1832, 4 of the top 5 popular songs belonged to a gentleman by the name of Lowell Mason. The popular songs, though, he happened to be a church music director, and his songs were all music putting the church text to music and providing them around the country. That inspired him in 1833 to create the Boston Music Academy. And the Boston Music Academy is where he created the first method in 1834 about how to teach music to students in an academy setting. He propagated this idea across Boston so that in 1838, they actually introduced music into Boston public schools. It is the first time that music programs were part of public schools in the United States. And Lowell Mason was made the superintendent of music for the city of Boston. The reasoning that they used to justify it is interesting. It said they decided to include music as a curricular subject because of the moral, physical, and intellectual nature of it. Moral because it was tied to religion, physical because you filled your lungs when you were singing, and intellectual because the study of music had been tied back to the Middle Ages, back to the Greeks. That was the justification. Not because of the intrinsic values of music, but because of all of these other values that they propagated. So then, in 1839, Lowell Mason comes out with his big hit, Joy to the World, published in the Modern Psalmist. It was all the rage in the United States as popular music at the time. In 1860, a new Mason comes into place, Luther Mason, and he introduces music education into Cincinnati public schools. So now it's starting to pop up in other places. In 1865, it was the golden age of brass bands. 10,000 brass bands across the country. That was the golden age of brass bands. In 1870, Mr. Mason comes out with the first text for teaching curriculum in the United States. And that text was targeted at general classroom teachers because we didn't have music teachers at the time. So this text was to empower teachers to be able to teach in their own classrooms. In 1886, the first music teacher school was created, the Crane School of Music at Potsdamer guy. There we go. Yeah, I learned a long time ago to be successful in the music business, you had to either come from Crane or marry someone from Crane. I did both. In 1890, the National Education Association creates the first music, the music section. So it was a special interest group just for teachers that were interested in the area of music. This is the beginning predating MENC. Then we get to the turn of the century, 1900, and the biggest stars of 1900 were the Haydn Quartet, the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, and that gentleman of all gentlemen's, JPS, or as I like to call him, John Philip Sousa, ladies and gentlemen. He's in the house. JPS is in the house. He was the Beatles in 1900. Honest to God. That was popular music in 1900. But at the same time, in 1907, some of the teachers, not happy with what was happening with the National Education Association, came together and formed the Music Supervisors National Conference, the predecessor of MENC. They met to talk about what they needed to do proactively to move music education forward. In 1912, they came out with some ideas about the things that the government needed to do to put these programs into place, and proposed accreditation for chorus, music appreciation, girls' chorus, band, boys' chorus, and glee clubs. That's what they were putting into these programs at the time. But also at the time, the instrumental music educators began to complain. The band directors were complaining because they weren't being taken seriously. Their music was the popular music, but they weren't in the school. They were outside of school. The only ones in the bands were the people that couldn't sing. Honest to God, that was the justification. So they were frustrated. Their popular music of the time wasn't in their schools. They wanted to know, what do we do? How do we get it in there? So they started to organize and have meetings. In 1917 ends the end of the brass band movement. Brass bands as popular music, that period ended in 1917, and bands were not part of the curriculum in schools yet. Fast forward to 1923, and the first national band competition was created that began the process of bringing bands into the school programs. In 1925, we have the first school creating a music ed degree in Oberlin. Oberlin College creates the first four-year degree in music education. In 1927, popular music of the time belongs to Mr. Benny Goodman. He ushers in the big band era, a big band era that would reign for the next 20 years. Followed by that, in 1930, we have the appearance of the first string programs in a public school. So even though string orchestra music had been popular, it wasn't in our schools until 1930, and even just beginning to come into our schools. 1945 is the end of the big band era, and no big band programs are in our schools. 1946, we see that Shinichi Suzuki creates the first Suzuki string method, thereby ushering in a new way to teach strings in the classroom. 1947, the first degree in jazz education is offered by North Texas State. And then in 1950, the Suzuki method makes its way to the United States, and also our friend Louis Armstrong calls jazz America's music. But America's music was not in our schools. In 1954, we have the Berklee College of Music is created. There's our Berklee crowd. Named for the founder Lawrence Berk's son, Lee. He decided to put Lee at the end of Berk and created Berklee. That was how they named the college. Again, dedicated to trying to find a way to teach the newer styles of music that were emerging at the time. Then in 1955, we have the American String Teachers Association formed. So string teachers are gathered together because they're not being taken seriously in their schools, and they want to organize themselves and create a movement so they could get the program stronger. Also, we have rock and roll going mainstream with the big hit, Rock Around the Clock. That was a song that took rock and roll mainstream. And then in 1959, we have the creation of the American Choral Directors Association because the choir directors wanted to be taken more seriously in their work. And then in 1964, something amazing happens. These guys come to the United States. The Beatles come to the Ed Sullivan Show and completely turn our culture upside down. Garage bands popping up in garages. That's why we call them garage bands. And all of a sudden, this new phenomenon of popular music begins to take hold in our culture, but not in our schools. We see in 1965 that big bands begin to take hold in our schools. Not jazz, big bands. Because big bands was safe. Jazz wasn't safe. That wasn't the safe music. We can't have music in our schools that ain't safe, right? So then in 1967, we have the Tanglewood Symposium. Tanglewood Symposium, MENC, convened all the big thinkers from around the country. What do we need to do to reinvigorate music education? One of the things they talk about is embracing popular music at the time, the music that the teenagers were listening to, that we needed to embrace it. In 1967, How's that going? 1968, the National Association for Jazz Education is created. Again, same reason. Educators trying to figure out how do we get jazz to be taken seriously. And not happy to have one association, in 1971, they create another association, the International Association of Jazz Educators. I don't know how they made a differentiation between the two. In 1994, we have the arts recognized as a core subject, and we have the National Music Education Summit and the release of first national standards, all of a sudden beginning to institutionalize our programs the same way that we've institutionalized math and science and language arts literacy. Then in 1996, some short little guy has this crazy idea and creates Little Kids Rock. Followed quickly in 1997, the technology educators in music were frustrated that they weren't getting taken seriously, so they created their own association to address how they get their programs taken more seriously in the schools. That then is followed in 2013 by the creation of the Association for Popular Music Education. Ever hear that? Yep. Absolutely. See, and again, following along the same line with the other red boxes, people having a shared interest coming together to advocate for a particular point of view regarding how we teach music in our schools. Which brings us to where we are here today. Now, I've taken you on this journey because as music and musical tastes have changed, these ideas have not evolved in our schools. And they've not evolved in our schools certainly at the same time that they were popular. There is this historic lag with every single one. Band entered the schools in the early 1900s, but band music was popular for more than 50 years. Orchestras came in the 1940s. They've been popular for centuries. Big band came in the late 60s, when the big band era ended 25 years earlier. So here we are today, 60 years past the introduction of rock and roll. And a little more than a century later, when the band people were first going, please take us seriously, let us in. It's the same story, different content. And that's really the point. As one new area has emerged, it did not replace the traditions of the other programs, it became additive. And all of these are ways to engage our students in music, support the key reasons for my walk along that mall. The whole idea that these are the tools that we use to keep the promises of our forefathers. Your work here carries forward in that vein. And you will pass on what you do here so that others may carry it on as our field evolves. I don't care what type of music you use to engage our kids. What I care about is that you engage them with music. It shouldn't matter. So I share all this to make my 2 points. As a drummer, I can't do anything short. Always too much, right? We are the keeper of the flames of our forefathers. The very reasons that they created this country so that we could provide these opportunities for our students. It's their dreams that they envisioned for our nation that we are trying to fulfill. And just as things take time to evolve, music education specifically, as we review how the other programs have come into place, it is clear that the time for modern band is now. So in closing, I'm just going to share with you one final story. See, there's this great painting that hangs in the White House of President Theodore Roosevelt. And like all great paintings, there's an intriguing story that goes behind it. It seems that John Singer Sargent had been sitting in the White House cooling his heels, waiting for a time to schedule a sitting with the president. But Roosevelt was always too busy. He goes, Mr. President, when might there be a convenient time for you to pose? Now, bellows the president. And today, there at the foot of the White House stairway, stands Roosevelt in portrait, with his hand on the very same newel post. It's one of the greatest portraits of one of America's great presidents because it captures Roosevelt as he was, a man of energy and purpose, always on his way somewhere. Moments come and moments go, the president was telling Sargent. Here's your moment. Seize it and do your best. Well, I believe there's a lesson there for all of us. I believe that what you're doing here today, here's your moment. And it's important that you be serious about this work, because it is clear to me, from my point of view, that you, my friends, have a date with destiny. And it starts here, and it starts now. So I suggest you get to work. Thank you very much.